Good evening. I'm Dr. Lisa Peschel from the University of York's Department of Theatre, Film, Television, and Interactive Media, and thank you for joining us. My own research is on the cultural life of the World War II Jewish ghetto known in Czech as Terezín and in German as Theresienstadt, and this is a site that will figure prominently in our keynote speaker's talk. I'll be acting as your host this evening. After we've heard from our valued contributors, I'll return to introduce our keynote speaker, Ariana Neumann, and later to have a brief conversation with her before taking questions from you in the audience. Just a few technical notes to begin. If you have any technical issues, such as the loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event simply by using the original link. And if you are watching us live, you'll be able to ask questions of our keynote speaker, Ariana Neumann, during her talk, using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can also use hashtag YorkIdeas and hashtag YorkHMD to join in the conversation on Twitter. You may have noticed live captioning is enabled, and if you would like to switch the captions off, you can do so via the closed captions or live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. Please do remember that today's event is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch again on YouTube in a few days' time. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Charlie Jeffrey, Vice Chancellor at the University of York, to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and good evening and welcome to the 2021 Holocaust Memorial Day civic event online. We're very honoured to be hosting this event with our partners in the York Holocaust Memorial Day Steering Group, who with the City of York Council have been programming and presenting events across the city for 13 years now. Their continued dedication has ensured that the vital messages around Holocaust Memorial Day are visible and available to people of all ages across York, and for that we thank them. Let me offer a personal reflection on why those messages are so vital. I started out my academic career studying the politics of Austria between the mid-1920s and the mid-1940s. My focus was on ordinary people, not political leaders. I tracked everyday experience of politics, from the optimism for what a newly minted democracy could achieve after the First World War, to the polarization of politics that followed amid a succession of economic crises which an immature political system could not contain, and which paved the way for Nazi Germany to annex Austria in 1938. That annexation was popular among ordinary people in Austria. It provided relief for most Austrians from crisis and instability, despite the nature of Nazism. And it remained popular among ordinary people in Austria until the later stages of the Second World War, even with all the tacit and indeed actual knowledge that people had of the Holocaust. My point is not about Austrians or Germans. It's about something much more fundamental. It's about ordinary people becoming complicit in a murderous regime. Could that have been my forebears if they had been in Austria? Well, yes, it could. My point is that we must remain vigilant. We need to work hard to protect, to reassert, to cherish values that respect and tolerate our differences. That's why, for me, Holocaust Memorial Day is so important. And thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoy the interesting presentations and discussions that we have to look forward to this evening, and that you're able to continue some of these conversations beyond this evening within your own communities. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome the Right Honourable the Lord Mayor of York, Councillor Janet Looker, to say a few words, and then she will hand over to the Most Reverend and Right Honourable Archbishop of York, Stephen Cottrell. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Vice-Chancellor. It is a real privilege to be invited again to join the York's Holocaust Memorial Day, even though we are meeting and taking part in very different circumstances. I remember with a lot of emotion and a lot of pleasure last year's ceremony at St. John's University, which captured for me many of the essential elements that I want to emphasize in welcoming you all to this ceremony. On or around this time, we've come together worldwide to remember the terrible things that happened so many years ago now in Germany that became the Holocaust. And it is right and proper that we remember that, and we remember those events, and we take the pledges that we will be taking later this evening to remember, to build on, and to reconcile. But it is also very important, I think, that we remember that we have all had our part to play in one way or another in these different events. We have all, at some time or another, treated people of different communities, different faiths, different backgrounds as something other, something that we should not perhaps award true human respect and dignity to. And I have been particularly pleased over the last year to see that in various ways we are remembering in this country some of the terrible events that we were involved in as a nation in our past, and the relics of which still live very vibrantly today. I am thinking particularly of our involvement in the slave trade for many hundreds of years, which caused death and misery to so many of our African brothers and sisters. And the Black Lives Matter movement that has been gathering force over the last year is as important today in this country as well as it is anywhere. So I think we should all remember our own histories, our own past. The history does not go away, and we can use it and build on it. The national theme this year is Be the Light in the Darkness, and a theme which seeks to remember that humanity can and should rise above the darkness that unfortunately it so often has created. And we have to remember the peoples that are still suffering very severely in this world, some of the people that have been forced to leave Rwanda, some of the Muslim communities that are being dealt with very, very badly in China. We are still, as humanity, causing this distress and these outrages and these appalling catastrophes. So we must live, remember, and use this day to pledge again that we will do our best to, in our own communities, in our own dealings, fight the prejudices that come from racism, from the prejudices against people that we see as other. If you go back far enough, we cannot forget the events of 1190 in Clifford's Tower, the massacre of some 150 Jews, and that was the entire Jewish community at the time. So I hope you find this evening insightful and a reminder that we can all play our part in standing in solidarity to prevent these devastations that have happened and did happen and are continuing to happen in the world. It is now my great honour to welcome the Most Reverend and Right Honourable Stephen Cottrell, Archbishop of York, to say a few words.
Thank you, Lord Mayor, I'm humbled and honoured to be part of this Holocaust Memorial event, for in remembering these horrors and the millions of Jewish people and others besides who were slaughtered in the death camps of a wicked and godless regime, we commit ourselves here in this city of sanctuary and in our nation to building a world where these horrors are never repeated. And we do this, first of all, by the very act of remembering, by looking, painful and distressing though it is, at the human capacity for evil and the terrible ways we divide ourselves against one another, particularly on grounds of nation, ethnicity, and religion, and particularly the way throughout history that Jewish people have been stigmatized and persecuted. We also remember that each of those who died was a beloved mother, father, son, daughter, someone with whom we share a common humanity and with whom, for the sake of their memory and for the building of a better world of justice and inclusion, we commit ourselves to change. Inspired by this year's theme of being light in the midst of darkness, I therefore want to offer a prayer that, among other things, challenges me to change. It is a Jewish prayer, but a prayer that I believe can be offered by people of all faiths and shared by all people of goodwill. We don't know the author of the prayer, found in the clothing of a dead child following the liberation of Ravensbrück concentration camp. It shows that even out of the darkest and most unspeakably inhuman wickedness, some good and some light can shine, demonstrating that stripped of everything else, the one thing you can't take away from a human being is their decision to choose how they respond. And somehow, inexplicably, and for me, unimaginably, because I can't see that I would be able to have the same grace were I to be in such a position, this unknown person made this prayer. Lord, remember not only the men and women of goodwill, but also those of ill will. But do not remember all of the suffering they've inflicted upon us. Instead, remember the fruits we have borne because of this suffering. Our fellowship, our loyalty to one another, our humility, our courage, our generosity, the greatness of heart that has grown from this trouble. When our persecutors come to be judged by you, let all of these fruits that we have borne be their forgiveness. Let us be clear. Only the victim can offer forgiveness, which is, I suppose, why only a victim could offer this prayer. But even then, forgiveness does not take away the pain and horror that has been experienced, nor its consequences in people's lives. There is still a need for justice. But in the end, unless we seek the path of a justice that is tempered by mercy and that seeks reconciliation, a true shalom, then we risk further horrors, and there will be further genocides to come. It is for such a peace that we pray and hope for tonight. We will now share in watching a short film from the Holocaust Memorial Trust, followed by some words from student Rabbi Gabriel Cantor-Weber. Thank you.
Pierwsze słowo to było cygojny, szwajny, cygojny. Te dwa słowa. To pamiętam i z tymi słowami ja umrę.
Jews have 2 days on which we remember the events of the early 1940s. In January, we mark Holocaust Memorial Day, and in April or May, according to the Hebrew calendar, we mark Yom HaShoah. Holocaust Memorial Day commemorates the liberation of Auschwitz by Allied troops on the 27th of January 1945. It uses the Greek word Holocaust, meaning burnt in smoke. Yom HaShoah commemorates the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising on the 19th of April 1943, when Jewish resistance groups organized a brave if doomed revolt against the Nazis. It uses the Hebrew word Shoah, meaning whirlwind, a whirlwind that swept across Europe, taking lives. The timing and naming of the 2 days gives them 2 very different nuances. One is about people being saved from the Nazis by brave soldiers. The other is about Jews standing up for themselves, not waiting for help, and losing their lives in the process. One name refers to the terminal burning of whole groups, the other to a whirlwind which is destructive but, in time, passes. I think we need both of the days. We need to remember the courage of those soldiers who, despite not being involved as either victims or persecutors, risked everything to save lives. And we also need to recognize the agency of the persecuted people and their struggles for self-liberation. We recall the permanence of the Nazis' heinous acts, yet we remember that Gam ze ya'avor, this too shall pass. Yet of course it hasn't passed. The Nazis may be no more, but their ideas and intolerances and intentions are still very much alive. Genocide has reared its ugly head in Bosnia, in Rwanda, in Sudan, in so many places. And now we must turn our eyes to Xinjiang in northwest China, where the Uyghur Muslims are being rounded up and put into camps. Under the sinister name of vocational skills education and training centers, reports tell horror stories of constant electronic surveillance, nighttime interrogations, torture, forced abortions, and sexual assault. This horrifying regime of cruelty and persecution began with a series of discriminatory laws banning long beards and headscarves in the name of counter-extremism. The definition of extremism even extended to anyone who avoided alcohol or didn't watch state television. To the Jewish people, this feels all too familiar. Legislation and propaganda, then segregation. What comes next? There are 2 lenses through which the Jewish people remember the Holocaust. We remember the importance of the world taking an interest and intervening. We also remember to humanize the persecuted people. They're not just amorphous victims or numbers. They're real lives with their own agency and plans, hopes and dreams. Above all, we need to remember that Hebrew word shoah, whirlwind. It may eventually pass, and it's terribly easy for those of us not in its path to sit back, feel lucky, and stay tuned to our TV screens as we watch its destruction broadcast for a global audience. But no, we can intervene against this whirlwind. We can demand that our nation again intervenes, remonstrates with China, imposes sanctions, whatever would be necessary. Arik Hirsch, a concentration camp survivor, whose tour of Auschwitz I had the privilege of attending in 2015, wrote in his book, A Detail of History, "What hurts most is not the actions of the oppressor, but the silence of the bystander." He was alluding to the principle of Jewish law that one who has the capacity to protest another's sin but doesn't, they are nitapes al kol ha'olam kulo, they are held responsible for those sins, even for the sins of the entire world. But we mustn't get ahead of ourselves, for protest is something which occurs further down the line. The theme of this year's Holocaust Memorial Day is Be the Light in the Darkness. And that means our first step is transparency, teaching, the sharing of knowledge. An ancient Jewish teaching is found in a work known as Bereshit Rabbah, composed around the 3rd century CE. We are told, Rabbi Yehuda, son of Rabbi Shimon, said, "The light that the Holy One, ever to be blessed, created on the first day, a person could see with it from one end of the universe to the other. But once God saw the perverse actions of humanity, God arose and hid it, and reserved it for the righteous in the future." Wherever there is darkness, wherever light does not illumine, wrongdoing happens. Dark alleyways feel unsafe, and the media blackout in China makes it difficult for the world to see exactly what is going on in the vocational skills, education, and training centers. Rabbi Yehuda's dictum teaches that in the absence of the miraculous, all-encompassing original light of creation, we must each be our own light. Even without divine intervention, we can see throughout the whole universe if we choose to look. And having chosen to look, we can tell others what we've seen and heard and learnt. And those we tell will themselves tell others. And thus we create and spread a different sort of light. As we remember all the lives lost in the Shoah, in the Holocaust, let us resolve not to be bystanders, especially at such a crucial time, but instead to be amongst those righteous ones who spread light amidst the darkness of our world.
Thank you, Rabbi Gabriel, and there is much for us to reflect on in your words. Our next speaker will provide us with still more to reflect on with her incredible and very personal story of a journey of discovery that took her back to the atrocities of the Second World War through the eyes of her late father. In her remarkably moving memoir, described by Channel 4 presenter Jon Snow as a truly exceptional book, Ariana Neumann leads us across oceans, spanning a period of 90 years, illuminating the history of her family and events of World War II that, as we pledge on Holocaust Memorial Day, must take a permanent place in our collective memory. Ariana, it is a pleasure to welcome you, and I'll return after your talk to ask you some questions of my own and to take questions from our audience. Those of you watching, please do use the question and answer button on your screen to post questions for Ariana, and we will take as many of these as we can afterwards. Ariana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for that lovely introduction. There's a poem by Chilean poet Pablo Neruda that I have always loved, and it ends with the lines, "We need to sit on the rim of the well of darkness and fish for fallen light with patience." If you had met me when I was 17, I would have told you that I had no connection to Auschwitz, no connection whatsoever to the Holocaust, or indeed to Judaism. You see, I grew up in South America, far away from Europe, very far away from World War II. And I'm going to do something a bit strange. Because most people hide their baby pictures, and I'm actually not only going to show you baby pictures, I'm actually going to show you baby videos. And you might think that's a bit personal, but then this actually for me is incredibly personal. And I think the video will show you how my childhood was filled with light and joy. I grew up in the Venezuela of the 70s and 80s. I was that funny looking child with the older man. I was the daughter of one of Venezuela's most successful industrialists. He was called Hans Neumann. He was 50 by the time I came along. And he was not just an industrialist. He was starting museums and was involved in education and was involved in newspapers and wrote articles, and he was just so engaged with the present and so excited by the promise of the future and so busy that it seemed completely normal to me that he never, ever spoke about the past. So all I knew as I was growing up was that he had been born in Prague, that he had emigrated with his older brother Lothar in 1949. But that was it. There was no talk of his life before. Now, I grew up in the middle of Caracas, surrounded by this beautiful garden. And I was an only child, but I have friends and cousins. And inspired by Enid Blyton's famous five, I wanted to solve mysteries. I really just wanted to be a detective. So I started a detective club with my friends when I was about that age. And we would sit around and we would spy on people that worked in the house. And in one of those sessions where we were spying on people, my cousin mentioned that my father had moved a box, and he had moved this box very carefully, my cousin reported, as if it had some marvelous treasure. And he had put it in a bookshelf. So I waited for everyone to go, and I went and I found that box. And it was right there where my cousin had said it would be. I picked it up, and it was obviously contained no treasure. It was light, but I opened it nonetheless, and it was filled with what seemed like boring papers. But I wanted to be a good detective, so I looked through the papers. They seemed to be old, and then all of a sudden, something struck me. There was a photograph of a young man, a black and white photograph, and he was much less wrinkled than my father was by the time I came along. He also lacked the boxer's nose. But I had no doubt that it was my father because his eyes, I would recognize them anywhere. And I knew that was my father. But it really discombobulated me because just beneath my father, there was a stamp. The stamp had the face of Hitler. It said Berlin, and that made no sense because I knew my father to be from Prague. And what really threw me was the part where it said name. It wasn't my father's name. It wasn't Hans Neumann. It had someone else's name completely. It was someone called Jan Sebesta. So I ran that afternoon to my mother and I said, we're living with an imposter. We're living with someone who is not who he says he is. And she calmed me down and said, he had a difficult war. He had to pretend to be someone else, but he doesn't like to talk about it. So don't ask him too many questions. And I think then I became aware that there were other clues to this darkness that seemed to sort of seep through into this wonderful, seemingly carefree existence that we lived in. So there was, for example, in a house that was filled with beautiful pictures and many pictures of my mother, of her family, of my myriad Venezuelan cousins, of their friends. There was only one picture of my father's family, and it was a very odd picture. It was very small. It was by my father's bedside, and it always struck me as incredibly sad and unusual because most pictures have people smiling or they're posing or they're looking at each other. And this was a photograph of two people who I knew were my grandparents. I knew they were called Otto and Ella, but I never understood why that photograph was there. And it always struck me as just very sad and just a picture really of faded grays. And then there were other clues. There were my father's nightmares. And it was, astounding, but at least a dozen times I was woken up in the middle of the night, and I was woken up by screams, and it was my father screaming, and he'd be covered in sweat, and he would just be very, very upset, and he'd be screaming in a language that I didn't understand. And if I asked any questions about the pictures, or if I asked any questions about the nightmares, I was always told by my mother to not push it, and my father would either just meet them with a wall of silence or he would start to shake. Then in 1998, so much later on, I was living in Europe and I traveled, as one does as a tourist, to beautiful Prague. Now, we followed the Lonely Planet guidebook, and it said that you absolutely must visit the Pinka Synagogue. And a friend of mine and I walked in, and I don't know if you've ever been, but it is absolutely beautiful. Every wall is covered with the names, 77,297 names of the victims of the Nazis from Bohemia and Moravia, which is where Prague is. And as I walked in, I took 3 steps down, I just looked to my right, completely unaware of any connection of my family to the synagogue. And 6 lines from the top, you will see there was the name Neumann, which of course was my father's name. And I knew my grandparents were Otto and Ella, but I didn't know their dates of birth or death, and I assumed it could be anyone. But then as I looked down, there was my father's name, and his name was quite unusual. He's called Hannes Stanislav, and that was his date of birth. I knew he was born the 9th of February, 1921. Why was his name on the wall? And actually, unlike every other name on that wall, there wasn't a date of death, which of course made perfect sense because he was alive at the time and living happily in Caracas. But there was a question mark, just sitting there, alone in that sea of names. And I didn't really figure out the meaning or of that question mark, or really figure out the answers to that question mark until much, much later on. In 2001, my father died, and he left me a box. He left me that same box I had found as a child detective with that same ID card. And this time it was crammed with papers and photographs and documents of his time during the war. But it was a strange time in my life. My father died 3 weeks before my oldest son was born, and I didn't really feel ready to journey into the past. I assumed it would be filled with darkness and horror. I didn't think I could raise my kids with the joy that they deserved if I was simultaneously researching family history and the Holocaust. But with time, I realized that I wanted to be able to tell my children where they came from. And slowly, very slowly, I grew bolder. And I started asking questions of the family that remained. I hired a researcher in Prague. I traced people in the US, in Europe, in Israel, in Asia, in Australia. I knocked on strangers' doors, sent emails and left voice messages. And as if by magic, more boxes filled with documents started arriving, including one, which is possibly the most treasured box, which has dozens of letters from my grandparents, letters that had been snuck out of the concentration camp of Theresienstadt. And I started piecing it all together. I amassed over 1,000 pieces of evidence. I found the children of survivors, and I found the children of friends that helped my family, often by risking their own lives. And then it turns out that I was wrong, actually. My research had plunged me into this past, but amid the darkness, and there was a lot of darkness, there were also glimmers of love and of light. And I uncovered these marvelous stories of courage and of defiance. I now know that my father's family comprised 34 people. His immediate family consisted of 4. There's my Uncle Richard in the middle. There was Otto, my grandfather, Ella, my grandmother, my Uncle Lothar, who was born in 1918, and then my father, who was born in 1921. And they were a completely normal family, much like you and I suspect. They were middle class, They were Czechs. They were Jewish, but they were assimilated, and they owned a paint factory. Now, Lotte eventually had a girlfriend called Stenka, a girlfriend who wasn't Jewish and who was very independent, and she was studying law, and she drove her own car, and she was rather remarkable. And she was, I suppose, the other member really of the family. And the fact that Stenka had this independence and actually had also access to money and access to food from a farm became crucial, because in 1939, when my father was 18, the Nazis marched into Prague. Now I'm going to read you a short excerpt about what happened in Prague in 1939. It's about 30 seconds long, so it's not very long. In May 1939, Jews were banned from holding gun licenses. In June, Jewish pupils were expelled from German schools, and in July, there were laws stating that Jews were banned from the judiciary, from being lawyers, teachers, or journalists. In that same month, a decree was passed that non-Aryans must register their belongings, their houses, their cars, their bank accounts, their gold, their jewels, and their art. In July, laws were passed restricting Jews to restaurants with separate Jewish areas. In the coming weeks, they were excluded from swimming pools. They were not to enter parks, cinemas, or theaters. They were not allowed to travel without a permit. They had to surrender their driving licenses and eventually their cars and bicycles, their radios, their cameras, their stamp collections, their sewing machines, their umbrellas, their pets. Now, it's against this backdrop that Stenka really becomes the hero in our family. Because as the family's belongings and freedoms were taken away, Stenka helped the family. She took food and medicine and even carried messages between them because they were isolated and unable to travel. And that, of course, was completely illegal. I mean, even giving a Jew a cigarette was illegal. So ferrying messages and food for them was punishable by law. Now, in May 1942, life changed forever for my family. They received a transport notice. By this time, Lotte was married to Stenka, and that ironically saved him. Well, not ironically, but that the fact that he was in a mixed marriage saved him from being transported. So the transport notice included my grandmother's name, my grandfather's name, and my father's name. And the family knew enough to know that they should do whatever they could to avoid being transported. And so they did. They tried to pull every possible string to get out of that list. And they almost succeeded. They got Hans out and they got Otto out, my grandfather, but they couldn't get my grandmother Ella out. So Ella went on the transport in May 1942. And it wasn't until August that the family found out that she had been transported to Theresienstadt. And Theresienstadt is not at all far away from Prague. It's about a 50-minute car journey. And when Stenka heard the news, and I have told you that she's bold and independent, but she's also incredibly passionate and fierce, she decided that she was going to make sure Ella was okay. And with incredible courage, decided that she was going to sneak into Theresienstadt, that she was going to pretend she was one of the laborers. She sewed a yellow star onto her coat, and she went in and she found my grandmother, and she took her a shawl and some food, and above all, she took her hope. And I've traced Stenka's daughter, and I have Stenka's writings about this visit. I also have a description in one of my grandmother's letters about how much joy and how much hope Stenka's visit brought. And actually, Stenka then helped the family. She helped Otto and Lotte and Hans arranged for couriers to sneak parcels of contraband into the camp for Ella, and eventually for Otto, who was my grandfather, who was transported too. And these couriers then brought out these incredibly long and candid letters from my grandparents. And they were coded, but they were not censored, so they were very, very open, and I'm very lucky to have those. In November 1942, my grandfather Otto was transported. My father too was meant to be on the transport. And he went, they both went, they registered at the train station, they did all the bureaucratic things that you had to do, they handed in all their belongings, and the last little thing they would do before you boarded the train was they would give you a minute ticket so that you knew what number you were. And my grandfather was in transport CC, and he was 448. And this is my father's ticket. He wasn't transported, and he left it for me in the box. Now, in March 1943, the third notice asking for my father comes in. And he knows there's absolutely nothing to do. He is going to be transported. And he has these letters from his parents saying, do whatever you can, but do not come here. So he goes into hiding. He goes into hiding in the paint factory that's owned by the family. The manager, a very brave man called Frank Novak, builds a fake wall just by a small window. And they create a tiny cubicle where my father can hide. And it's a working paint factory. So my father has to be very, very quiet during the day, and at night he can escape. And I've traced Frank Novak's daughters, and they actually remember, one of them specifically remembers her parents' fights, because Mrs. Novak was understandably very upset that Mr. Novak was taking this huge risk by hiding a Jew. Anyways, it's when my father is in this minute room that his best friend Stenek comes to visit him. Now, Stenek and my father had studied chemistry together, and they belonged to a pranksters club as well as young boys. And I have a feeling they did more pranks than study chemistry. And Stenek, like many young men, he wasn't Jewish, but he had been forced to go and work for the Reich in Berlin. And he was working at a paint factory there. He was given a few days off to visit his family, and he came to visit his good friend. And they shared a meal by candlelight. And Stenek joked and said, Hans, if only you could come to Berlin. We're so overworked. And there's a Czech saying that says, goes something like this: the darkest shadow is just beneath the candle. So if you're going to hide anywhere, you don't hide in the periphery where the light is going to give you away. No, you go to the place where the shadow is at its darkest. You go to the area just beneath the candle. You go to the center of it all. And it's at that moment that my father does the absolute unthinkable, and he decides actually that the best place for a 22-year-old Jew to go and hide when you're wanted by the Gestapo in Prague is to go to Berlin. So with the help of Stenka and Stenek and his girlfriend Mila, he crosses over to Berlin. He uses Stenek's passport. He has a fake ID that they've doctored and a vial of cyanide just in case that he is found. And he crosses over to Berlin, gets a job at Warnecke und Bohm, the paint factory where Stenek was working, which was making lacquers for the Luftwaffe. This is a photograph from the 40s of the entrance at Warnecke und Bohm. You can see the environment that my father, a Jew with a family in the camps, had to live under. And there he passed off information to the Dutch resistance and lived for 2 years with his friend Stenek, who kept his secret. Now, this is possibly one of my favorite pictures that my father left me in the box. And it was taken in June 1943. And the taller one with the knobbly knees is my father. Next to him is Stenek. And they're standing in the Tiergarten in Berlin in 1943, right in front of Bismarck, the statue that symbolizes military might, and that was adored by Hitler. And there they are standing as if they had not one care in the world, these two Czech pranksters that somehow fooled the Nazis. Now, as much as there's a thriller core to this, because my father's unusual choice to go to Berlin is really quite outrageous and thrilling, and his life there is both horrific and exciting. This journey for me is really about remembrance. It's about telling the stories of those that lived or didn't live through horrible times. It's about finding light in the darkness. It's about capturing that light. Actually, it's about becoming that light. You see, in piecing together my father's past, I gained a family. I came to know people who were not so much forgotten as just veiled in silence. And in my research, I found that those people, even in those horrendous circumstances, found light and joy and somehow managed to maintain hope. This is one of the dozens of letters from my grandparents in Theresienstadt. This one in particular is from my grandfather Otto, and it was written on Christmas Day, 1943. And these letters are amazing because they're filled with details, horrendous details of the camp, but they're also filled with anecdotes about beauty. My grandmother, for example, writes about flowers, the flowers that blossomed in Terezin, oblivious to the horror, and how those flowers filled her with memories of her country house, the country house that she missed so much. And my grandfather, who was by all accounts a pretty petty and grumpy man, and definitely a terrible singer, writes in one of the letters that he's so buoyed by the parcels from his children that he is so joyful that as he goes to work the next morning, he finds himself crooning a comic song. So even in the darkness of the camps, my grandparents found light. Amid this horror that they lived through, they found some beauty. Because of course, people can imprison your body, but they can't really imprison your mind. Now Stenka, the brave, beautiful Stenka, snuck into Theresienstadt twice. She brought my grandparents supplies when the couriers couldn't do it. And she actually brought them what they most needed, which was hope. To thank her, my grandfather, who had nothing left to give, stole a piece of copper pipe in the camp. And with a nail and a hammer, I'm told, he fashioned this object, which is a ring, and he engraved her initials, Stenka Neumann, on them. And that ring, it's all I have of my grandparents. But to me, it's also a symbol of love and of gratitude. And I have something of that light of my grandparents today with me, because I'm wearing that ring around my neck. So it's a little bit of light from the camps. And I wear it because it connects me to my grandparents, these grandparents that I've never met. Now, today marks 76 years since Auschwitz was liberated. I now know that of the 34 members of my father's family, 29 were sent to camps. 25 didn't come back. And it turns out that I do have a connection to Auschwitz, because my grandparents, who were so filled with beauty and hope, were gassed there in August 1944. Forgive me. Actually, just yesterday, a historian via Facebook Messenger who had read my book and who was actually trying to be helpful, sent me an image of a notebook that shows me exactly in which crematorium my grandmother ended her life. You see, perhaps because they're my grandparents and I've just gotten to know them, that's not what I want to know about them. What I want to know is how they lived. These are 2 photographs that I now have of my grandparents. They're no longer that horrible picture of faded grays. On the left is my grandmother, Ella. On the right is my grandfather, Otto, with his beloved Stenka. And this is how I carry them in my heart, full of happiness, full of life. Now, as we reflect today, I think it's so important to remember that the Holocaust didn't start with military invasions and massacres. Like all genocides, it started with an almost imperceptible process of dehumanization, with petty laws about typewriters and about umbrellas. It started with words that we use every day, words that cement otherness, that perpetuate stereotypes. And ultimately, we choose the words we use. And it's us who decide. We can use words to continue to divide and fragment, or we can use them to tell stories of people. We can use them to build bridges and craft bonds. So please choose to tell stories, because if we're going to learn from history, we have to humanize it. Data and numbers are important. Perhaps because I'm awful with maths, though, I forget data and numbers. People do not forget stories. So we must tell stories of this darkness, because in doing so, we also tell stories of light. In 2001, Holocaust survivor and Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel said, "We tell these stories because perhaps we know that not to listen, not to want to know, would lead you to indifference. And indifference is never an answer. So please choose to not ever be indifferent. Choose to be moral, even if those around you choose to bury their head in the sand. Because if it wasn't for Stenka and Mr. Novak and brave Stenek, who often stood alone and risked their lives under huge pressure not to do so, my father wouldn't have survived, and I wouldn't be here today." So if you have a choice, and I actually think we always have a choice, like US poet on January 20th, Amanda Gorman told us, choose to be the light. Thank you.
Ariana, thank you so much for making the choice that you exhort us to make. Thank you for your choice to share this story. As you know, due to my own interest in Theresienstadt, my own research on the ghetto, I've got a very avid interest in your story, and we had the great good fortune to have an extended conversation yesterday. I've prepared just a few questions that will let us share with the audience some of the remarkable things that came up during that conversation. And then in just a few minutes, audience, I will hand over to you, and happy to help convey your questions to Ariana. But here's one question. So as you said, your father passed away in 2001, and due to various, your son was born so shortly thereafter, and due to other things, you didn't really start doing the research until some years later. But there was a particular moment, if I recall correctly, that enabled this research to become a book. Could you talk a bit about that?
Well, it was quite fun. I mean, lots of things, I suppose, enabled it to become a book. But as I unearthed these stories, I have lots of degrees in literature, and I think that kept me from writing. But as I unearthed these stories, I didn't write them down, but I kept on telling them to people, because it kept my family with me, because it was a way of sharing and processing. And I think I bored my family to tears with the stories. And we were in New York City. It was 5 a.m, and we were in the airport. And I looked up, half asleep, and there was Simon Schama. My family went, "Come on, go say hello to Simon Schama. Tell him what you're telling about your story." And I'm not quite sure why, but they sort of pushed me along, and I said, "Hello, Mr. Schama, can I tell you a little bit about what I'm doing?" And he was pretty wonderful because he heard me at 5:30 in the morning or whatever time it was probably actually before 5 o'clock in the morning. And he said, you must absolutely tell these stories. You must write a book because that's what we Jews are. We are our stories. That's what we as people are. So tell the story. And I eventually actually exchanged emails with him, and I put it all down in a little summary. So it's so that he could read it. And it was thanks to Simon Schama I then had a summary that I could send to publishers. So it became a book in 2018, so pretty late in the research. So it's really just a personal journey of discovery for me. That's how it started.
But this is just, it's such a remarkable moment that Simon Schama, who's written some of the most respected books about Jewish history and culture, that's the person you encounter in the airport.
Coincidences. I don't think I've ever encountered anyone else famous in any form airport since.
You know, I have so many other questions I would like to ask you, but I would like to hand over to the audience. I'll just ask you one more question. I understand your book has just won a prestigious award, and it's only today that you can actually reveal this publicly. Please do tell us.
Oh, I'm just so honored, and it's wonderful that it's come out today. So my book, there's an association in America called that give out the National Jewish Book Awards, and my book has just won the best memoir of, this year. So I'm just I'm beside myself with joy. It was a little memoir. It was never meant to be a book. So to win this award means so much, and the fact that it comes out today is particularly meaningful because actually the award is not really because of my words. The award is really because of the stories, and it's those stories of those people that couldn't tell them. So really the prize is for them, is for the 25 people in my family that didn't come back, and for all the others that were too traumatized to tell their own stories.
Well, congratulations. And I will now pass along a few questions from the audience. And I'm sorry, we probably won't have time to cover them all, but we will cover as many as we can. One is, and this is one that I also had when we spoke, the girlfriend who smuggled herself into the camps, Zdenka. I mean, it's Holocaust Memorial Day, and this question of what do we do as bystanders? What do we do when we're not the ones, as Rabbi Gabriel said, that the whirlwind is heading toward, but we can see the injustice happening? What do we do? What did happen to the girlfriend who smuggled herself into the camps?
Well, you know, she called it as she was. She was bold and she was brave, and she worked in the resistance. And then eventually, unfortunately for my family, the marriage, I think they were both too shattered after the war. The marriage between Lothar and Zdenka ended. But Zdenka continued actually to defy rules and laws. And she was, she was part of the movement in the 60s against and part of the Prague Spring, and she stood up against the government, and she was a source of defiance, and she always called injustice when she saw it, which takes courage, because obviously, as we spoke yesterday, I think you always have the people that call it, and maybe the people that you have the people like the Nazis, and then the people that call the injustices, but 95% of the people just are bystanders and say nothing at all.
Okay, thank you. We do have there are a few comments in the questions about people who actually have resources for you. So we'll save all of those. Apologies, I won't bring those up right now, but we will save those for you and pass those along to you. Here's a very challenging question, and then I'll come back to a few more personal questions. Tribalistic attitudes and entrenched notions of otherness have poisoned human nature for centuries. How can we find our common humanity?
I actually think we tell stories, and I think we have to actively, I think we're animals at the end of the day, and we're sadly biologically trained to sort of look at other tribes as the enemy, but we've gone beyond that, right? We have moved beyond that, hopefully. So we have to actively challenge those instincts, and we have to find what it is that binds us to one another, because actually we aren't different tribes. We're all one community. We're all human beings, and we're on this planet, and we have to just see ourselves as that. And we have to actively, just challenge those notions of otherness, and, the us and the them. And whenever we catch ourselves doing it, we need to stop and remind us of how much we have in common, because whatever separates us tends to be minute, and maybe 0.5% of what makes us who we are. So I think we just need to actively challenge it. And I think language is absolutely key, because language, of course, shapes your brains and it shapes your notions. And if we start by changing our words, I think it's brilliant, for example, that Biden, I don't know if you read this, but Biden has just decided that undocumented immigrants in America are no longer going to be called aliens. They're going to be called non-citizens. And I think actually that is an absolutely key thing to do, especially after the 4 years of the rhetoric that we had from the previous president. I think it's wonderful that he's really embraced this. Okay, I'm going to take rhetoric back. That's where we start. That's how we start to heal.
See, and as someone from the US, I'm very glad to hear this, because the danger of divisive rhetoric, we've seen where it leads historically, and all of us need to work against this today. Just a few more questions from the audience, and then I'll share some information about your book and how people can get a hold of that. A question about your father. How did he end up going to South America? And he did keep his pre-war name, did he not? He still went by Hans Neumann even in South America?
He did. He just never talked about the fact that he came from Jewish ancestry, actually, at all. And he always maintained that you create who you are. So he tried in 1938 to emigrate to America. Him and my grandparents and Lothar and Stenka did. But as I'm sure you know, the US had quotas, and their visas were never approved. So I think by the time the war had ended, they had two uncles, Uncle Richard, who was in one of the photographs, who emigrated in 1938, and they had one that Victor that had emigrated in 1919. They helped the brothers, and what the brothers knew how to do was paints. So they had a paint factory called Montana, in very random name for a Czech paint factory, but it was called Montana in the Czech Republic. And they decided that they had to start, a paint factory called Montana somewhere else. And they did a lot of research. The possible places were, I suppose, Australia, Cuba, Israel, and or Argentina and Brazil. They settled in South America, and they figured, well, Venezuela was the only place where there wasn't a paint factory that actually manufactured. So that is why they settled there. And there's a wonderful letter from my uncle to the boys saying, actually, if you can cope with the mosquitoes and the lack of culture, which I think he meant, there's not a lot of opera houses and things like that in Venezuela, you can create a pretty good life there. And it's true, you could in the 70s and 80s, perhaps more.
Thank you for sharing that footage at the beginning of your talk, just to give us a bit of a flavor for what your life there was like. I have one more question for you, and then I have just a few final remarks before we close. A final question: is there a particular question you would ask your father now, if you could?
Oh, there are so many. There's one moment when my father, right after he's saved from the transport, so November 1942, is called into the Gestapo headquarters in Prague. And I have the telegram of him being called in, and I know he went. And I just have no idea what he discussed. I have so many little things, but I would love to know what happened there, because I really don't have any idea. And I've spoken to historians. Of course, I have hypotheses, but I don't know. And I just want to know how he did it. I want to know how he lived in Berlin, knowing all he knew, surrounded by Nazis, and how he managed to just, keep it together, and then how he managed to rebuild and recreate himself again when he came to Venezuela. So too many questions, actually.
Too many questions, but thank you for sharing the answers that you have found with us. And again, I've just got a few more remarks. Lillian Colson, thank you for sending through this comment. Rabbi Gabriel is the student rabbi for the York Liberal Jewish community, and the community is very active during the lockdown. They're using Zoom for their own services and ways to keep in touch with each other. If you would like to know more about that community, please look at the website jewsinyork.org.uk if you would like to learn more about them or to get in touch. So I'm sure that many of the people joining us tonight would be keen to read your book and to find out more about this fascinating story. Signed copies of Ariana's book are available from Fox Lane Books. Again, that's Fox Lane Books. You'll find the link in the chat. So all that remains for me to do now is thank all of our speakers this evening and to thank you all for joining us. We can all choose in our own ways, large or small, to speak out against discrimination and persecution, and to play our part in creating light in the darkness. To symbolize this choice, we are pleased to be joining several other landmark buildings in the city by lighting our own central hall in purple light this evening to mark Holocaust Memorial Day. We'll finish now with a specially commissioned film of the Stockholm Declaration and the 7 Commitments. This film will continue to be used after this evening as a resource in local schools and colleges. So once more, thank you so much to Ariana Neumann, to all our speakers, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Representatives from 46 countries around the world met in Stockholm in 2000 to discuss Holocaust education, remembrance, and research. No doubt prompted by articles published by a number of high-profile Holocaust deniers and the rise of right-wing anti-Semite groups internationally. At the end of this meeting, all attendees signed a declaration, committed their countries to preserving the memory of those who had been murdered in the Holocaust. This statement became known as the Stockholm Declaration. In January 2020, as the world marked the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, ministers from all countries in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance agreed to underline and renew the 7 commitments made in the Stockholm Declaration. We will now hear those 7 commitments recited by members of this Holocaust Remembrance event.
We recognise that the Holocaust shook the foundations of modern civilization. Its unprecedented character and horror will always hold universal meaning.
We believe the Holocaust must have a permanent place in our nation's collective memory. We honour the survivors still with us and reaffirm our shared goals of mutual understanding and justice.
We must make sure that future generations understand the causes of the Holocaust and reflect upon its consequences. We vow to remember the victims of Nazi persecution and of all genocides.
We value the sacrifices of those who have risked their lives to protect and rescue victims. It is a touchstone of the human capacity for good in the face of evil.
We recognise that humanity is still scarred by the belief that race, religion, disability, or sexuality make some people's lives worth less than others. Genocide, anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, and discrimination still continue. We have a shared responsibility to fight these evils.
We pledge to strengthen our efforts to promote research and education about the Holocaust and other genocides. We will do our utmost to ensure that the lessons from these events are fully learned.
We will continue to encourage Holocaust remembrance,
by holding an annual UK Holocaust Memorial Day. We condemn the evils of prejudice, discrimination and racism. We value a free, respectful and democratic society.